Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. This is the Atticus Partners post-budget event. I'm joined by two great speakers, Siobhain McDonagh and James Brougham. Is that the right way to pronounce your surname, James?
Room close enough, but I forgive you. I would expect that. That's how I would
Brilliant.
read
Great.
it.
All right, good. Well, thanks for joining. Can I get you guys to introduce yourselves and then we'll launch straight in and talk about the budget. So, Siobhain, obviously long-standing MP, but if you could tell us a little bit about your background, what you've been doing in Parliament, and what you do now on the Treasury Select Committee, that would be great.
Hi to everybody this morning. I'm the MP for Mitcham and Morden in South West London, where I was born and brought up. I've been a Labour MP since 1997. And as Mike said, I'm on the Treasury Select Committee, where I take a particular interest in consumer rights and the, the expense of being poor in Britain. And just between you and me, what I'm particularly proud of might have been crowded out by the budget, but yesterday we became the first constituency in South London to get a banking hub approved.
Amazing. Congratulations.
Thanks.
That is great news, and I know will make a big difference to your constituents, which is brilliant. Great. And James, go ahead.
Good morning. First of all, let me apologize. They're rebuilding the world around me, so there might be a little drilling going on. So I'll keep my mic muted when that time's kind, but hopefully it's not too disruptive. I'm James Brougham. I'm a senior economist at Make UK, and what Make UK are, if you're not familiar, we're a manufacturers organization. We represent the views of manufacturing from small to large right across the country and Wales. We work with our partners in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And so, of course, we're quite invested in the policy announcements by the Chancellor yesterday, and I'm looking forward to talk more about what works for us for the sector and what perhaps we were a little disappointed not to see.
Brilliant. Great. Well, I'm assuming that you guys and also our participants are fully aware of what was in the budget yesterday, so I won't give you all a rundown of what the measures were. But if you could both just kind of give a brief sort of 3 to 5 minute overview of what you thought the key points were and what you think the implications are. In your case, obviously, Siobhain, for the government and the kind of Treasury Select Committee perspective, but also for your constituents as well. And then, James, I'll come to you second and get you to give the Make UK an industry perspective. So, Siobhain, over to you.
I think the overall feeling at the moment is one of relief, given the amount of tensions and briefings surrounding the entire budget. There will be many in the Parliamentary Labour Party who will be absolutely delighted by the removal of the two-child cap, even though it does come at over 3 billion in cost. But the idea that we could be getting close to 500,000 children out of poverty will be something very warmly welcomed. I fully appreciate there will be concerns about the change in how much you can invest in a cash ISA for the under 65s, some concern about the increase in tax on properties over 2 million. But given the dilemma that the Chancellor faced, I think she's done a very balanced budget and she's come out of it intact. And as at the moment, as far as we can tell, the bond markets appear to agree.
Yeah, the bond markets seem, broadly speaking, happy with the situation, and they are indeed, along with Labour MPs, the general public and the business community, one of the key constituencies. And you're right, the bond markets have been broadly flat or positive over the last 24 hours. So that's, I mean, that's a big fillip for Rachel Reeves that she's got their approval. So that's a good sign and a good sign for economic stability in the country. And indeed, I think government borrowing costs have come down a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And that, of course, frees up huge amounts of money there for the government to do other things with, like improve public services, which is what we're all keen for. So, James, over to you.
Well, I think the sector sort of weren't born yesterday, so they knew that this was going to be. It was one of intense speculation, and knew not to hold hopes too high. I think, of course, we did have the mention, and most of the sector's reaction with regards to the business policy announced. It's sort of in the reads. It's small things, some positive, some a little larger than negative. I think unfortunately on balance, the sector views the changes that have been made as slightly more punitive than beneficial. Of course, and I think this potentially will have missed the overall high-level announcements for anyone that watched it yesterday. But me and my team have been trawling through the whole document. There are some positive changes around capital allowances. So that's on a technical basis, that's the amount of for qualifying investment, how much you can potentially write off your corporation tax bill. There are some good signs there around the inclusion of leased equipment under full expensing, a small amount. So that is particularly something we've been campaigning on to enable smaller companies, SMEs, to access new technologies, whether it be cleaner, greener, more productive, without having to face the full cost of capital up front. So those things are positive, particularly set against the backdrop of a really challenging fiscal environment. Of course, to keep the positivity, to find the positivity there, we're very glad, and very kind of the Chancellor herself to mention us with regards to the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme. I think that is the cornerstone of really what we've been campaigning for in the run-up to this budget. And for anyone that's not aware, we think it's really important. It is effectively, in practice, a means to equivalize industrial energy costs to our European peers and competitors, but also globally. It's quite infamous that the UK's industrial energy costs are some of the highest in the world, if not at a given moment, the highest in the world of any modern manufacturing nation. And so to equivalize that base input cost would really be a huge change for British industries' ability to compete on the international market. So we're really glad that we'd hope to see that bring forward a little bit more, but we're very glad that the Chancellor has, and we understand, personally driven that forwards to go to consultation, because of course it is a rather controversial point within various facets of government in order to intervene in the industrial energy market in such a seismic and unprecedented way. But for the automotive sector, this is a niche point, but important. They'll be a little upset as part of some of these changes, particularly with the changes on EVs. Now, we do understand the rationale that coming out of reduced receipts for the exchequer through decreasing road tax, through the adoption of EVs, that new pay per mile. But something that's quite small and it wasn't announced directly, but is part of the papers, is to change something called the employee car ownership scheme. So British-based automotive manufacturers effectively have a scheme that allow them to overproduce and provide vehicles to their employees. So this is particularly for those large bases, such as those based in the Midlands and those up in Sunderland. And we reckon that that'll reduce volumes in the UK in a given site. And I won't mention the name, but quite a famous household name, about 8,000 vehicles. Now, it's been our position that this has never been a tax loophole, but more so it's a vehicle to allow, excuse the pun, to allow the sector to produce more vehicles and prop up a second-hand market. And so that they'll be quite upset that that's changed. There's some changes, and I could go on all day really, but I think one that's for employment, one will really sting, especially after the NICS change we had last year about raising those costs of employment. Again, apologies if the drilling is coming through, is the changes to salary sacrifice and pension. Those pension things. So to overall combine, these are just small nudges towards making the cost of employment for businesses in the UK just that ever much so higher, which makes it less attractive to employ and suppresses that job market somewhat. So that's one of the more negative sides, and perhaps I think in the mind of most manufacturers, that'll be the one they're paying attention to, particularly given how fresh the changes to NICS were in the last budget in terms of raising that cost of employment year on year. So in short, I would say, a mixed bag. On balance for your average industrial player in the sector, I'd say on balance is going to be slightly more negative than positive, but I'm really quite glad to see that the Chancellor has managed to weave in some positivity, particularly with regards to capital allowances, and give some future sentiment around the incoming British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was both very helpful. So we've got loads of time for questions. So if you are watching this, please ask a question in the chat, and I will pass that on to James and/or Siobhain. But in the meantime, a couple of questions from me. So my main question, actually, same question to both of you, is obviously in the run-up to general election, post the general election as well, that one of the main things that the Labour Party talked about, Keir, Rachel, but most of the cabinet as well, and other spokespeople, was the need to get the economy growing in the UK. Getting growth going was the big thing. I mean, at one point we talked about having the fastest growing economy in the G7, but certainly growth through the milestones, through the missions, through the various other kind of resets of government comms that we've had over the last few years, growth has always been number one. In your view, does this budget do much to move growth forward in the UK? And if so, how? And if not, what does Rachel Reeves need to do over the rest of this year and in next year's budget? So I'll come to you first on that, Siobhain.
Well, I think it must have been a temptation to look at reducing the amount of capital investment that she announced last year, but she hasn't gone there. She's continuing to keep up one of the biggest public investment in infrastructure in almost 30 years. So that's there, and that's the commitment to growth. I think we've seen the OBR suggestion that the economy will grow by 1.5% rather than 1%. So they are all encouraging signs, and she remains committed to changes in the planning law, which have been difficult to get through Parliament due to our problems with the House of Lords, but looks like it's about to just come on the books. So I think those commitments are still there, and temptations to go for other cuts, austerity or tax increases that would really affect growth haven't happened. And sometimes in politics, it's what you don't do is as important as what you do.
True, all true. Thank you so much for that. And James.
Well, you're asking an economist about whether I think 0.5% is a lot, and I would say it's in we're moving into the measurement error territory really. And so if I had to speak frankly around growth, it's a diminutive change. I understand why the Chancellor stood on that OBR forecast at Atticus. It's an improvement. It's frankly in the reads 1 to 1.5%. It's in our opinion, it's not growth. We do understand the challenging fiscal position. A lot of that is really in a sort of ironic, fortunate sense. A lot of the revenue targets and indeed the growth itself is a product of the very inflation the government's trying to quash. If an inflation had been much lower, the amount the receipts, projected receipts to come to the exchange would be nowhere near that fiscal headroom that we heard announced and sort of celebrated yesterday. In terms of achieving this, and particularly I apologize to anyone that may or may not be on the call that's heard Makey K bang on about this before, but a lot of it's about acceleration. So again, the big scheme is a good example, but we've said this before and we've said this again, is that we won't effectively with business policy, and I do appreciate, I don't want to muddle my words and get my definitions wrong. We don't think this was an austere budget, but we do think in terms of the rate of pro-business policy, particularly with pro-business investment policy and business support, we think it's tantamount to an austere business environment. We want to see those particularly capital allowances we think should be big, be bold. That's particularly support for the energy market. The government should be looking through a lens of not just we've got one sector asking for something, another sector asking for something else, but look at the frank picture about how does competition look within Europe, particularly for British goods manufacturers in the industrial sector in the UK. We sort of don't operate on a national basis. We're competing with across Europe, and now particularly with the changes in tariffs in America, there are some opportunities with trade diversion compared to the different tariff treatment with the EU versus the UK. And so that's really the bigger picture here, and thinking about how can we position the UK as fast as possible to take advantage of any new value chains, new trading relationships that we might have. And all of that requires an equalization to the best of the government's ability of those core input costs. So, of course, naturally, we're never going to be able to compete on things with the Far East, on things such as labour and health and safety, and probably for right reasons. But we hamstring our own industrial economy through these levies, through levies on energy costs and other means such as that, and particularly within a very constrained labour market, as I mentioned earlier. Although we have the positivity mentioned from the Chancellor about making sort of apprenticeship costs for small and medium businesses under 25 free, which is absolutely fantastic. That's very good, but at the same time, it's a little bit give with one hand and take with the other across the entire sector with regards to the cost of employment and the attractiveness of employment through those changes to salary sacrifice. So it's something that, if you allow me to go on a bit more, through the industrial strategy that we saw published before, really fantastic sentiment, but now we're not quite seeing that joined up policy being delivered. And again, we are sympathetic to the fact that it is a challenging fiscal environment, but it's these levers around on a holistic approach. What's going to drive the international competitiveness of British businesses? What's going to enable the sector to deliver that growth that we so need? That is, with any luck, a bit bigger than 0.5%. It's in a sense investing for the future, not in a financial sense, but it will come out the mud through that goods manufacture. With then subsequently the services sector will be able to continue to grow around without fostering that core from the mud industry, British industry that is. We will not drive that growth.
If I could just say, Mike, just to come back, as James knows, the figures predicted by the OBR on growth do not include our recent trade deals with America, with Europe, or with India, because they feel they've happened too recently. So there's a lot there that we don't currently have calculated that is hopeful.
Yeah, and to support what was said there, actually, we think, contrary to narrative, when we look at our data and talk to our members, we think it's particularly interesting. US trade has actually been slightly more optimistic than perhaps the narrative would have you believe. When we have our own proprietary data with trade, and even anecdotally talking to members, of course, it's no surprise that in the run up to those tariffs biting, US goods exports flew through the roof very quickly. Just as a quick fun figure, don't quote me on an exact billion pounds, but in the first half of 2024, so sort of H1 2024, UK goods exports to the US was about 26 billion pounds. Now, that same period in 2025, so the first half of 2025, it was closer to 41 or something to that effect. So that scale change, and of course, a lot of this is companies rushing to beat the gun, to beat the shot, so to speak, on those tariffs. But it's interesting that actually, according to many of our members, that impetus has continued, and it will take some time to measure this, but we do think there are trade diversive effects occurring with the different tariff treatment that the EU is receiving from the US tariff regime compared to the UK, which is generally across most things a little softer. And so what that means for US customers, if they're looking to redraw value chains, particularly for industrial supply chain reasons, for things they might have previously sourced from EU partners, there may now be a tariff incentive to source them from the UK. Of course, breaking supply chains and redrawing value chains is something only industrial supply chains do. It's really neat because often a surety of supply is better than a 5-10% cost differential. But quite surprisingly, according to our members, that outlook is actually looking better than most of the sector expected before those tariffs bit to support what was just said there. So there is some upside, we think, in trade, more so than the narrative would let on.
Okay, well that is good news. So thank you for that. Now, I did want to ask you both about employment because in the reading that I've done and with many of the business leaders I speak to, one of the things that is a real concern for people is the state of employment in this country and indeed the repercussions of some of the choices that the government has made. So obviously a year ago we had the national insurance increase put on employers, and that's for many companies, particularly bigger ones, of course, vastly increased the cost of employing people. We've now seen changes to salary sacrifice, and that will impact people's, businesses' costs and also impact their ability to put money into people's pensions. There've been other changes too, and obviously the minimum wage rise that we've just seen again increases the cost for employers. At the same time, we've got, I think, record numbers of particularly young people out of work. I think it's about 14% amongst unemployment amongst 18 to 24s. So there are real concerns that the choices the government is making it more difficult to keep unemployment down across the board, and particularly for young people. So I just wanted to ask both of you, do you think that's an accurate perception of the repercussions of the government's choices? And if in either way, what more does government need to do, particularly to get young people into employment, if they're not already in employment or education or training, but also across the board? I think we're about 5% unemployment now, which is again, uncomfortably high. We obviously want to see both of those numbers come down. So Siobhain, I'll just come to you first on the employment question.
On the unemployment question of young people, clearly it is a worry. And I think many of those young people are looking for jobs in areas such as finance and banking, where I think we are seeing the increased use of AI at entry-level jobs, just increasing difficulties, even with, our young graduates in that area. The Chancellor announced that Alan Milburn, the former Health Secretary, is undertaking a review of unemployment amongst young people, and also that a job would be guaranteed for young people who are not in work or training.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. James.
Yeah, I'll start from the top with Nick's, really, if I may, is that in practice, and I'm sure most people on this call will I'm sort of going to state the obvious here, is that the NIC, the change to NICs, the tax sort of on the employer side as opposed to the employee side, is largely semantics. It was immediately seen, through settlements, pay settlements with companies. I understand that widely. 98% of the industrialists that I talked to, there wasn't that much margin left in it, so it just went immediately, 0.5% to 1% on settlements that year. So it was felt by businesses, but also the employees there. Tough decisions, were made and are still being made, on that basis. It's of course it's a demand-based situation. So if the demand isn't there for a manufacturer, the capacity, they don't expect to, they need the capacity in a coming year for whatever reason, trading reason, other reasons, the sector will look to cut costs exactly wherever it can. There is often this misconception that a lot of, particularly in the middle market, for British industry, that there's margin left to cope with these things. It comes from somewhere, and unfortunately, it does so often come from employment, because other things are not immutable, such as the energy costs, the capital costs, the plant costs, site costs. But one of those things that unfortunately, something's got to give, and it is often particularly where there may be employment. But the sector is reluctant to do this wherever possible, because once we lose skills from the sector, it's impossible to get them back. Particularly with the average age within the sector, the average age of engineers, we have a recruitment issue, which I'll talk about a little bit. Why changes to especially the entry level roles in employment. We had some positive news around apprenticeship levy, but once these skills of the average age pushing high 40s leaves the business, so they don't come back. And so that's something the sector's got really aware of, that it does not operate, it does not have the privilege of operating in general, a hire and refire policy, which is why generally the upcoming changes as referred to in the Employment Rights Bill, it won't touch the sector that much, because the sector doesn't engage in sort of hire and rehire practices. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in the economy, that's probably more so on the retail side of things, because the privilege isn't there to just pick and choose. The access to skills, it is, of course, doesn't require explaining that British industrial activity tends to not be metropolitan. It tends to be in more remote, potentially rural areas. And so the local skills pool is extremely constrained relative to more metropolitan areas. And so it's not a decision taken by choice, but by force, because you can't just lower the energy bill. There was a second part to that question, which was, how can we drive this forward? And I think this is the largest area of Make UK policy, and my skills colleagues would be able to, do this far more justice. But it's around, particularly for young people, and how they come into our sector so often excellently through the apprenticeship system. Which businesses and apprentices themselves, once they're on in that relationship, tend to think it's a really fantastic system. How it runs is currently broken with the apprenticeship levy, and often basically the sector pays in more than what it gets out from the levy. We've long been calling for a reform on this. It's great to see some positive movement with regards to the announcement yesterday that small and medium businesses effectively won't pay for that training under 25s, which should incentivize some of that drive for recruiting young people. So much of the challenge, though, unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword, is supply. Many of the businesses that want to seek apprentices either can't get them in their local area. There isn't the appetite potentially for a separate perceptions issue around old Victorian workhouses, which does not reflect the modern high-tech manufacturing of today, and availability of skills provision. So that's further education colleges that might create a frankly untenable situation for a business where a young person might have to travel hours in order to take part of their training, and then hours to come to work. So often the logistics there are a bit of a challenge, and those things together provide that issue, which is, for better or for worse, the policy can change, but when the fundamental supply of young people's availability to come into these businesses is limited, then we've got a double-edged sword that we need to address. And of course, it's not to sound sensational, but this is a slightly ticking time bomb, to use such a sensational sentence, because not over a year, but over 10 years, this median age continues to increase. We get natural wastage within industry, and skills exit the business faster than they come in at the bottom end, which is a challenge for the long-term sustainability and competitiveness of the sector on a global stage.
So all of that is some of the things that you would want the government to address over the next year or in the next budget.
Some of these are those policy levers we can do very short term. We're not completely born yesterday in the sense of right in a year's time the government can drum up a supply of willing labour that wants to enter the physical goods sector as opposed to the services sector overnight. That's a 5 to 10 year plan, which we know, which is why the industrial strategy exists, in order to ensure that continuity in policy that should outlive parliamentary terms.
And just last question on this, because we're kind of veering off topic of the budget, I realise. But is the industrial strategy good enough as it covers skills, training, employment, and rebuilding that supply chain?
I'll start with that. It is absolutely the right vehicle. It is something that we need to hold to account consistently. We of course have it on a statutory footing. We have the Industrial Strategy Council. It's been just over a year really. It's something that we'll need to look back in 10 years' time. So it is completely the right vehicle. We were one of the only modern manufacturing nations to not have such a thing. We have our peers and competitors over in Germany, Italy, all have sort of iterations on the same principle. We did not have that here, which meant we were getting left behind on a policy standpoint. This is the strategic vehicle that the sector needs. It is now the job of this government and successive governments to do it justice, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, great. Brilliant. Right. Thanks. All very interesting and very useful to know. Thank you for that. So we'll get straight back onto the budget. So one question, obviously, over the last year or 18 months, I mean, since Rachel Reeves became Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the things that has been talked about ad nauseam really has been the government's headroom and the fact that she only left herself about £9 billion of headroom last time round when we had the last budget. So that's now gone up to 22 billion, which is obviously it's more than double. It's a lot more fiscal headroom. So that gives her much more room for manoeuvre, much more protection from shocks, which is a great thing. So my question really is that enough? A, to calm the bond markets, B, to calm the political commentators of this world, and C, probably most importantly, to allow Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer to make the decisions they want to make for the economy without fearing that they're going to lose that headroom and face the consequences. So, Siobhain, come to you on that question.
We're only 24 hours from the budget, but as of the moment, it doesn't seem to be an issue for the bond market. They've responded very well, very calmly to the budget. Commentator-wise, you've got any range of commentators, haven't you, who appear to be able to criticise any part of the budget. But I certainly haven't seen any suggestion that she was wrong to increase the headroom or that it's not enough. What we know in politics is we never know what's around the corner, but certainly seems like enough, and it's certainly going to be reassuring to everyone.
Great. Thank you for that. So next question that's come in is on the OBR, which is confirmed that welfare reversals, which I think was the decision made in the summer over disability, will cost 7 billion. And scrapping the two-child limit will add 3 billion more by 2029, 2030. So the question is, how can we justify this expansion in welfare spending while pushing taxes up to historic highs? And the total tax take will be 38% of GDP by the end of the decade. So come to you first on that, Siobhain.
We're actually seeing a reduction in the growth with people claiming incapacity benefit. I think growth fell by about 73%. We are recovering from a legacy of huge expansion in welfare benefits under the last government. Clearly, it would be stupid to suggest that it's not, an issue of conflict within the Parliamentary Labour Party. But we are seeing reductions, as I've said, in the growth after years and years of exponential growth. We've also seen falls in personal independent payment claims. Stephen Timms, one of our most long-standing ministers, is undertaking a review of how that can be reduced. And Rachel Reeves, in her budget, did take some of the worst anomalies of the mobility scheme, where people who are disabled can get cars. She's taken out the luxury Mercedes car from the list of cars available. And I know all of us can't understand why it was there in the first place, but good on her for doing that. issue about the two-child cap, it comes at a considerable cost. But the question you have to ask is whether you visit the consequence of the behaviour of parents on their children. And there are 500,000 children, just under 500,000 children, who will benefit from that. If those families have more money, they have more money to spend. We may see an improvement in the educational attainment of those children, because we can draw a line between poverty and poor educational attainment, and that benefits us all for the future.
I agree with you. I mean, I firmly, personally believe that getting rid of the two-child benefit cap was the right thing to do. In part, it's the best thing for those children and their families. Also, because of the consequent impact on society. Because you're right, it does mean that those children will get better educational attainment, and it does mean that they will therefore have more productive careers, be less likely to be on benefits later in life. So there is a consequent societal benefit as well as a personal benefit. However, and this is my anecdote, I was at a spectator event last night. So, I mean, obviously not a room full of fans of the government or therefore fans of Rachel Reeves. But they did a kind of straw poll in the room, and I was sat right at the back. They asked people to raise their hands if they agreed with getting rid of the two-child benefit cap. I was the only person in the room to raise my hand. And what that told me, I mean, obviously this was the spectators, to bear in mind the audience, but what that told me was that those of us who were in favour of getting rid of the cap, I just don't think we've won the argument on it. So even though it's now happened, I think we still need to be making the case for this policy, those of us who agree with it. And that, of course, by extension, goes to the government as well. But James, come to you, same question.
Yeah, I mean, in an official capacity, it's because Mickey K doesn't have a formal position in it. I think our soft position would be at least conversations with our skills leads, who I always defer to because they know a lot more about these things and the secondary effects. Is generally positive. Even though it's just a little bit beside industrial policy for us to directly engage with. That said, on the wider principle of where changes to welfare, from Makey K's vision, it's around is this encouraging people that are potentially economically inactive back into the workforce, which increases that supply that we've just detailed around challenges around shortage of supply, shortage of labor. So any movements or any sentiment that moves economically inactive individuals back into being economically active, we would support wholeheartedly. And however, of course, the individual machinations of how that occurs can sometimes more fall into the remit of social policy and less away from industrial policy. So we wait on the wing to celebrate any changes that do move people into economically active positions, except wouldn't expressly comment on the more social concerns that bring them there.
No, that's quite understandable given your role.
Can I just also add, Mike? Sometimes there is a misunderstanding, isn't there, about this view that people work and don't get benefits, or don't work and get benefits. But actually, the vast proportion of people who are in receipt of universal credit and who are currently are under the two-child benefit cap do go to work. So this will make it easier for those people who are on very low wages and get it topped up through benefits.
Yeah, that's true. I think even those of us who talk about these issues all the time, we still have a kind of slightly old-fashioned view that you're either on benefits or you're in work, and it's an either or, and it's black and white, and it's binary. Whereas, of course, as you say, the vast majority of people who are in receipt of benefits of some kind are also in at least part-time, if not full-time employment, but just can't make ends meet. Which brings us back round, of course, to the minimum wage conversation. So the next question that's come in. So the OBR, this is one for you really, James, cites historic underinvestment as the core cause of weak productivity. Does this budget's capital spending program, which is now over 120 billion in additional public investment, meaningfully address barriers manufacturers face?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the OBR's observation, and this is not a critique of the OBR at all, but it's that is exactly correct, and I suppose it's the elephant in the room, and I don't think it's any surprise that just because the OBR published it yesterday doesn't make it a sudden revelation. There has been relative, and if you buy any metric, but we're not really pointing fingers. Is it a private sector issue? Is it a state issue? But that underinvestment quite easily point to compared to our peers in other manufacturing nations has been a cause or a driver of lack of productivity in the UK. I think there's a whole host of reasons there, but one of them is probably on a sentimental level that ourselves, even within the UK, we don't view ourselves as major manufacturers, despite until very recently last year being in the top 10 manufacturing nations in the world in terms of value of output. And so that sort of disjoin between we actually make a lot of stuff, we generate a lot of value from production in the UK versus the perception that we don't, and that goes to investment markets, that goes globally, that we're a services economy is the focus, and so it doesn't receive, on a sentiment basis, the focus and investment that it needs. Unlike, to use such an obvious example, somewhere like Germany, where not only is its economy entirely foundational on production, but they know it too on a government, business, and investor level. That drives that economy, which has potentially been one of the sentiment reasons why Germany, as an example, hasn't seen that sustained underinvestment in its production sector that we have here in the UK. Now, you sort of mentioned, has the changes today enough to redress, the OBR finding yesterday? Of course not. You're not going to undo 10, 15 years of underinvestment. And again, this isn't pointing the finger at government. This is just a sort of status quo. This is what has happened. Where, for blame game can happen later. It's a small step at the moment, and I don't want to get overexcited about the changes to capital allowances because it is a tweak at this level. And there is an element, and I have sympathy for any chancellor that wants to promote a pro-business investment policy. There is to use the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you can provide the pro-business investment policy, but if the market mood isn't right, the sector won't invest, it won't seek finance, it won't invest, even if the incentives are amazing. And so much of that overall, when we do our work, we know over 80 to 90% of the sector, their lead cause for investment is capacity and market sentiment. And then it's only supported by those whatever government pro-business policies are available at the time. They're never the leader. So it's the horse. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And the wider business environment conditions, have to be right for that to happen. And at the moment, they're not quite.
Okay, so you're hoping to see more action on that?
Yeah, there is. We're hoping to see the global demand conditions improve. We're actually not alone in this at the moment. In the short term, the European demand market for industrial goods is suppressed. So the sort of intertrade dynamics were all suppressed. In that environment, combined with relatively high inflation, relatively high cost of capital, with no real expectation of that coming down fast, it leads to when business owners and MDs and whatnot are looking at the future sort of investment roadmap for 5 years, it's not right now. Relative cost of capital, even if these pro-business policies exist, they can't be confident that the demand is going to be there to use the capacity they might invest in this year that will drive their capacity next year, when the future outlook, as indeed by the OBR's very forecast, we might look at and say, well, growth, we're not expecting much growth. It is not going to be a hive of activity in the next 12 to 24 months. So investment decisions are paused in the main.
Or which of course, in its own way, then inhibits growth.
Yeah. I mean, my understanding of the OBR's report is that they do actually lay the blame for the lack of growth at the last government's cuts and lack of capital investment. And what we saw yesterday in the budget was the highest public investment for the last 40 years. And this is at a time when the Chancellor was under extreme pressure to increase headroom and not go too far. So I think the fact that she has resisted all calls to cut capital expenditure indicates her personal and the government's commitment to get building, the reservoirs, the dams, the houses that we so desperately need, and will encourage growth in our economy.
If I to come back on that on pro investment policies as well, we always it's our view, and it's many academics' view as well. As a classic figure, which is 1 to 3 is normally used in general, which is for every pound spent in public money in terms of incentivizing investment, the return is £3. And we particularly think it's completely net zero cost in the medium to long term to the Chancellor to incentivize this investment, whether it comes off the corporation tax bill or through any other vehicle, because of course you'll see it back through enhanced receipts of businesses growing in spades, but it just might be perhaps not in this parliamentary term, or it may be in 5-10 years. But if the door's open to say invest away, and we'll which to give a credit, as of the two sort of fiscal year events ago, we had the imposition of permanent full expensing, for which we do applaud the government, because it's exactly that consistency. And of course we did have announced yesterday by the Chancellor that will remain permanent. Now, it was supposed to remain permanent as of the last budget, but an announcement that suggests that the cornerstones of the business environment are going to remain consistent are a good thing. So one of the biggest complaints in the year is the chopping and changing.
Yeah, and can I just say, particularly as a London MP, thank God this week we finally got government approval on a third runway at Heathrow, because the ridiculous nature of how long this decision has taken in the face of obvious need to improve our premier airport. I mean, it's ridiculous. But I, for one, I'm so relieved, and I'd like to get my own cement mixer down there and actually get on with the job.
Well, we'll look forward to that. I've got a question coming in. This is really about public trust. So the question is about Rachel Reeves' claim or pledge that she wouldn't put up taxes on working people prior to the election, and indeed many, many times after the election as well. So the question is about the fact that tax has been put up from 20 to 22% or 40 to 42% if you're a higher rate taxpayer for savers, landlords, and on dividends. So that's a tax increase. And of course, the vast majority of the people who will be savers, landlords, or receiving dividends will be workers, will be people who will be working in some sense. There's, of course, the other factor, which isn't mentioned in the question, but is relevant, which is the fact that lots of people are being brought in to pay tax for the first time because of their wage increases, or they'll be moving from the basic rate to the higher rate of tax because of fiscal drag. So all of this is an increase in taxation on working people. So one very basic question is, has Rachel Reeves broken her promise? But in a sense, that isn't the question that's being asked. The question that's being asked is, I'll read it to you, is how could it be the case that any future manifesto pledge can be taken with any confidence, given the rate of tax has been increased on certain sections of society, obviously, but indeed on all workers because of fiscal drag. So I'll come to you first with that, Siobhain.
Well, I, for one, am just really grateful that we didn't see an increase in tax rates, because certainly it appeared to be suggested a week, 10 days ago, that was the route that the Chancellor was following. I think that obviously that would have been a complete break with manifesto commitments, which I personally do not think we should be doing. The idea that we don't need to rebalance, though, how tax works in the UK, that if you are a landlord, you don't pay tax at the same rate. But if you are a tenant on receiving less money in your household, you pay more tax. That is iniquitous. And we've seen an ever growing differential between people being able to buy certain things or have certain assets and just not paying the same rate of tax, while those going to work and on PAYE being taxed more highly. So the fact that she's brought that into balance strikes me as a fair and reasonable thing to do, because the people that the system's actually been going after is the younger people, rather than those who are older. And it is a difficult issue about the intergenerational balance of taxes. But I certainly think that her changes yesterday were reasonable. That people are unhappy about that, I can completely understand. But given the choices that she had available to her, I think her balance is right, and those with broadest shoulders should take the most strain.
Great. Thank you. James, you may well just say no comment because this is obviously a political question.
No, we did actually have a
Go on.
comment. To say something positive, we think it's commendable because it's a tough position just to start about where the tax is coming from. Is the ideological starting point. We understand from sort of Labour tax insiders is that this is right. It's a tough fiscal environment. Where can we find, at least while we have to change the mainline rate somehow? And we could all argue about the semantics and say, well, it's not a rate change, but the leaving the thresholds where they are, it's tantamount to the same. And from a semantic point of view, the promise has been kept. And I think we can all argue about stealth tax all day, but it's those small changes, as Siobhain mentioned, around changing, coming at it from fairness, and we see it across the board in little areas here and there. We think that's the commendable approach. And it's through the challenging environment that it's really had to look under the cover and say that's a bit of an unbalanced tax treatment for whether it be the example of group of landlords and tenants and so on and so forth. On that, the high level question of do we think the Chancellor has broken her promise? No, and publicly no. We would say that we don't think on a semantic level, technically not. It's we're not political strategists, but we would say boxing oneself in so long ago, it's a tough position and it's going to be held to account by media and any detractor. It's really been the view of business, I think it's fair to say, which is taking a lofty view, is if you had to break your promise, I don't think the business community would stand in aghast, and it's a bit of a gotcha primetime TV moment than it is a practical grown-up conversation about where we need to go next. So yes, we don't think technically the promise has been broken in semantics by leaving those thresholds at the same way. The Exchequer has had to raise the funds through a different vehicle, which is I think they're projected to raise about 8 billion by that move, 7 to 8 billion by leaving those thresholds as they are in and of itself.
No, it's a significant sum of money, and I think about 1 in 4 workers will be in the higher wage bracket, the higher tax bracket, rather than that by the end of this parliament. So I mean, it is significant both in terms of what it raises, but also in terms of the numbers of people that affects. But I totally, I completely understand that the government has to raise money from somewhere. These are the choices they made. But indeed, it's not particularly relevant to business, but it certainly will be relevant come the next election. So next question definitely much is for you, James, which is the national living wage rises to £12.71 in April, and I think the youth rate also goes up to £10 something. I can't remember what the exact figure is. What does Make UK modelling show about the effect on manufacturing firms, margins, and hiring plans?
Yeah, this is a really big area, and it's and I imagine most of the learned people on this call will already know this, but it's something until you hear it, you may not be aware of. It's the wage differentials, and so when Make UK sort of throws its hand up and says, "Well, hang on, we want to talk about sort of seismic changes to the minimum wage or the living wage," it's actually not to be misconstrued as we want to keep the lowest paid, most entry level roles at a lower wage. It's really about the differentials within organizations, which is frankly when a living wage or minimum wage change occurs that's large, it sort of ripples throughout, often right up until the executive level, particularly in any sort of shop floor level, that pay ripples through. And so when they've already been suppressed, we've had through rhyme or reason a challenging time with inflation. We've seen a very fast wage acceleration on average over the past 5 years compared to previous decades previous. What that causes within organizational structures that effectively when that whatever it might be 5, 10, 15% goes on, it ripples immediately up through. So then you're paying that potentially the manager of that person was on that wage is now that differential is so slim, the incentive structure is wrong, so that the organization must move a lot of the chain up. People will look down over their shoulder of what the role they worked in for 3 years and see now it's paid 10 penny less than what they're currently getting paid. And so then that puts demands on settlements, and so it drives it right the way through business. So the cost to business is often a surface level analysis will say, well, there's not that many people in your sector on the minimum wage, so the net total cost is going to be X. It's going to be relatively small. It neglects to include the ripple effect that actually, progressively and a slightly decreasing exponential, you'll be paying it right the way through your business. Now, of course, for large employers in the UK, compound that with the NICS change, you have a sudden overnight, practically in 12 months, massive increase in your cost of employment. So you can just imagine what the incentive structure there is, particularly where it potentially you might have to make difficult choices or find cuts elsewhere.
Yeah, and just follow-up question to you. So obviously the youth rate has also gone up, and I think there's a long-term plan to equalize the youth rate with the standard rate, so that you'll be paying people the same whether they're 18 or whether they're 35 or 55. Uh, I can totally understand the rationale for that. However, there is a concern that that will disincentivize firms from employing younger people because they will think, well, if I can get a 28-year-old who knows what they're doing, why would I employ a 21-year-old who doesn't know what they're doing? Is that reflected in the manufacturing, is that view reflected in the manufacturing sector, or are businesses unconcerned by that because they will still need people to kind of fill in certain job positions up the scale?
I'm going to immediately start by chucking around grand suggestions at the retail sector. Anecdotally, because it's an interesting point, and we do cover data on this. Just anecdotally, every single manufacturer that I am engaged with when I ask this question, they pay the upper rate. So
Right.
they pay the what you might want to call the high adult rate, whatever you want to call it. There is a
However old
for it.
people are.
Sorry.
However old people are.
Correct. That's
Right.
now. I'm not saying that's not a universal data point, but in the hundreds, manufacturers I've talked to, I'm sure there are cases where this is not the case. But generally speaking, it's because at that level and at that differential, the challenge is attracting the people to the workforce within that business more so than the 70p drop down depending on the exact age. I think it is well more used within the retail sector because of course it's the more supply is great in typically those more metropolitan areas. It's just not a big enough change to negate the need for the requirement of supply and attracting young people into that workforce. And of course, where possible, so many young people will be on a completely different route altogether through an apprenticeship. So actually the use case here for the British industrial sector is quite niche, and normally the attractiveness of being able to offer people that full whack, for lack of a better word, at the outset serves for attraction more so than the sort of hey penny saved by being exact on the 18, 19, 20, 21 rate.
Yeah, no, I get that. Well, I think that counts as a good news answer, to be honest.
I think so.
Thank you for that. Siobhain, your thoughts on the minimum wage and the rise?
The national living wage, that's for people over the age of 21, goes up to 12.71. The minimum wage for somebody between the age of 18 and 20 is 10.85, and £8 for a 16 to 17-year-old. So there is still remains a differential, and there is more within the budget. There were more incentives for apprenticeship, as James has already mentioned, the fact that many small and medium sized businesses will no longer pay for the apprenticeships. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? I cannot believe that the increase to 10.85 for an 18 to 20-year-old disincentivizes somebody over somebody older. People's employers' practices generally depend on the kind of skills and ability they need from the people they have.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Siobhain. I wonder whether we've lost you there briefly. You'll be back.
Sorry.
No. I think we lost you there for a second, but I think we caught what you said, unless there's anything you wanted to add.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, great, good. All right, well, I've got another growth question that's come in. So this says the budget restricts writing down allowances, reforms salary sacrifice, national insurance contribution relief, removes low-value import VAT exemptions. Will these hamper growth? I'll come to you first with that, James.
Yeah, so my team have been looking at this frantically all evening. I'm actually well into 6 p.m. The machinations of the changes to the writing down allowance, the change full expenses. There's a tweak here and a tweak there. What we actually understand is that one of the main differences with writing down allowances, as we understand it, and we're sort of work is ongoing at the moment about what the impacts will really in truth will be, is that the car, one of the main reasons, the things that are included within WDA's writing down allowances that aren't within the other capital allowance regimes, such as annual investment allowance and full expensing, is car leasing. And so we actually think there's a little, because of the changes to the employee car ownership scheme, which they reckon is about 100,000 in volume, will go down through those car related employers that offer car schemes that aren't under the company car tax regime. That this is potentially a small counter lever to allow more to wind down those allowances. I won't comment further at this point because we've gone around the houses with changes, and we've had representations from some of our largest members that say, well, this pretty much, by our calculations, this at least how we use the capital allowance system, this wipes out any benefit of full expensing. And then we've talked to other members on their use cases, and they'll say, oh, it's actually a very minor point. So it's a good question, and it's well identified, and it's exactly what the team is working on today. So potentially tomorrow in a day's time, I'll have more to comment on that.
Well, we'll have you back next time, and we'll ask you then. So that'll be good. Siobhain, what are your thoughts?
The issue on the levies on items of small value brought into the UK was actually a question at our Parliamentary Labour Party meeting on Monday before the budget, because apparently what's happened is with Brexit and the change in trading policies, we saw a huge exponential increase in the number of items posted into the UK, found online, and that this brought micro and small businesses in the UK at disadvantage. So this is intended to give some space for those businesses and was lobbied for by a number of Labour MPs. How much difference all the changes will make, I don't know, but they're all there in order to help.
Great. That's really useful. Thank you. Right, we're coming up on time, so I'll just give you guys one more question and then just ask for any kind of final comments. And I think final comments, and indeed the question itself, are just thinking about the future. You know, what's the future of the UK economy, the future of the economic policy of this government, the future of growth, future of manufacturing, etc. So the question is, in your view, is this budget stabilising the UK economy, or is it merely holding the line while deeper structural problems remain unaddressed? So in commenting on that, obviously I answer the question, you know, is this holding the line while leaving deeper structural problems unaddressed? And if the latter, what do you think the government needs to do over the next year and in the next budget to address those deep structural problems? So I'll come to you first with that, Siobhain.
Well, productivity is the really biggest problem, isn't it? And I can only see that is going to improve through the use of artificial intelligence, particularly in the public sector. The only way we're going to see improvement in public sector services is by the adoption of AI, which brings its own difficulties. But there are always difficulties. The idea that any budget in any circumstances could resolve all the difficulties that exist or develop it's ridiculous, isn't it? You know, you have to constantly make progress. And I am confident that the Chancellor has done the best she can in the circumstances that she has, and that she has the confidence to go further.
Great. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And James, final words to you.
Yeah, I think I would agree with the sentiment. I think it's satiated the market. It's provided that short-term stability. These are good things. It is not bold, and it does not go for growth in the future. So these two things can be true at the same time. It's not quite true to the ambition set out in the industrial strategy, despite being a challenging environment. However, we will only grow through bold commitments in growing our foundational sectors, and then sort of meeting the tests that have been set out. That's all correct. The markets are happy. I think you answered my question for me when you said, is it the former or the latter? I think that it was a very succinct way of putting it, which is that happy for now, the markets are happy. There are underlying structural problems with the future investment and productivity growth in this country that are not addressed by this budget.
And indeed, we all want to see this government address those problems over the next 12 months, and indeed over the next 3 years, and run up to the next election, and beyond. Maybe we will see. Siobhain, James, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both, and I've definitely learned things from listening to you both as well. So thank you for that. I'm sure we'll have you both back on next time we do one of these. In the meantime, have a great day, and thanks to everybody for joining as well. I hope that's been useful for you. And thanks again to everybody. Bye bye for now.